Welcome to Balkan Moto. Today we're going to try to fix whatever's going on with that. Let's check it out. Alright, so after I installed the forks on last time and did all the measurements, I was pretty curious as to why the hell did I just lose 12 centimeters of travel in the forks. And I did some more research, and turns out there was a few issues. First of all, the instructions from Progressive Suspension said to utilize the stock spacer on top of the springs. Now, I remember when I was installing it, I did notice that the combined length of the new spring with the stock spacer was significantly shorter than the old spring with that same spacer. The old ones, when you put them in and the forks were fully extended, you could see it like about an inch sticking out above, so you needed to essentially preload that spring. On the new ones, it was actually just below the thread of the cap, so technically no preload whatsoever. That was the first kind of clue as to something was actually not right. So after doing some more research, there should definitely be some preload on these springs. So today we're going to swap out those spacers for some pre-cut ones from PVC pipe that I've made. The other thing that I think is probably the main reason why the forks just dropped down so much was that I ended up replacing the washer that fits between the spring and the spacer. And I believe that the washer is actually not the right size. So I believe it's actually gotten sucked up into the metal spacer that's in the forks. And the spacer's actually slid down. So essentially making the fork kind of like not having a spacer at all. So I'm losing all that travel just to that. So today we're going to jack the bike up, open up the forks at the top, see what's going on inside, take out the old spacer, maybe swap out the washer between the spacer and the spring with the old one. And then we're going to try 4 different combinations of PVC spacers at the top to see which one works the best to set up the static sag on the forks properly. Another thing that I also did in my research was I looked up how to properly measure static sag. So I'm going to show you how to do that as well. So let's start by jacking up the front of the bike so that we can undo the tops of the forks and see what's going on inside. Okay, as expected, the spacer is actually gone. So it's gone clean around the washer and probably all the way down. So I'm gonna have to figure out how to take that out. Probably gonna have to pull the spring up as well. Also, this is the reason why you don't over tighten these. They're very soft, and I'm pretty sure I've tightened it way too much, so that right now it's kind of very difficult to undo. So I might need to bang this out of the way and replace it with one of the ones from the old bike. I probably will replace these caps anyways with preload adjustable ones instead of the air, but either way, let's try to get it off. So this is what a fork cap on the Sabre looks like when it's undamaged and properly torqued, and this is what it looks like when you over torque it and you try to take it off. Nothing works, and the material it's made of is super soft, so you just literally have to chisel it off. So this is trash. We're going to replace it with one from the old bike. Now as for the forks, same sort of situation is happening on this side where the spacer seems to have synced all the way. So let's take that out, measure things out, and put the proper spacers in. Alright, so took off the old spacer, and here's what the problem was. So the old spacer, as you can see, is cut down the center, so it can actually flex. And this is the bushing that came with the progressive suspension, and it's my fault that I didn't realize that they're not the same size as the stock ones. So if you put the new bushing over this one, you can see that the old bushing is obviously bigger. So with this new bushing, when we use this metal spacer, you press it hard enough, it goes right in. So that's exactly what happened. And then because of the bushing, it widens it off just enough so that it actually slides right over the spring. So we're not going to use this, we're not going to use this. We're actually going to reuse the stock ones, and we're going to use these 4 sets of spacers. So in order to set the preload properly on the front forks. So the old spacer, you can see it's less than 4 inches. I believe the exact measurement is 3 1/4 inches. So if we were to add up the old length of the stock spring, or the spring that I had in there, with this guy, and then compare that to the new length of the new springs, the spacer that we need to actually make the total length the same as the 4 inches and 3/8, so it's this guy. But before we install that guy, we're actually going to start from the lowest and move on up to show what the difference is between the 4 different preloads and how that affects the static sag. So let's put the old washers back in with the 4-inch spacers and drop the bike and measure things out. The new spacers were coming up pretty much right to the top of the fork tubes, so that's quite a bit more preload. So we're going to try to get these in. So let's get the caps back on. We're just going to tighten them enough just so that they're all the way in, but not enough so they're properly tightened. And then let's measure the sag. Alright, so as we can see, the front is already much longer. So what we're going to do is we're going to measure the 2 things. I'm going to sit on the bike and compress the front forks, then measure the distance from the rubber seal to the bottom triple tree. Then I'm going to pull the forks up and then let them settle and measure again. And we're going to take the average of those 2 measurements. And then we're going to compare those with the fully extended length between the top, the dust seal and the bottom fork. And that will give us how much distance the fork has sagged in statically. And then we'll compare that with the overall travel of the fork and see where we sit. So let's measure that out. Okay, so now let's put on the next spacer that's a little bit longer, 4 inches and 3/8, and see how we are doing then. Here's the 4 inches and 3/8, or 111.125 millimeter spacers. They stick out about 3/8 of an inch above the fork tubes. So let's get these in, measure out the sag. Here we have the 4 3/8, and we're changing it to a 4 5/8, or 117.5 millimeters versus 111.125 centimeters. So you can kind of see how much bigger it is. Let's get the other one in and cap them up, measure up again. All right, and here is the 5-inch 127 millimeter spacer versus the 4-inch 5/8, or 117.5 millimeter. So that's almost an inch above, and it's probably going to be a bitch to compress and get in there. One thing to mention, when you are putting the caps on with preload, It's very important to keep them very flat and not going at an angle, because the caps, as you saw, are a very soft material, so it's very easy to destroy the thread on them. It's a good idea also to like clean the thread on the inside before you start screwing them on. So let's put these 5-inch ones in. I think they're going to be overkill, but either way, let's try them out, see how what difference they make. All right, so what did we learn after all of this back and forth? So after I did the math, the 4-inch spacer that I had essentially averaged out to about 5.05 centimeters of sag, which is the Sabre has 5.5 inches of total travel, which is about 140 millimeters or 14 centimeters. So that 5.05 centimeters ends up being about 36.07% of the overall travel. Now the 4-inch and 3/8 spacer, that one ends up being about 33.21%, and the 4-inch 5/8 is about 26.07%, and the 5-inch that we have on right now, that's only about 21.79%. So what do these percentages really mean? As you compress the spring, obviously it adds more, or it requires more force to compress the spring initially, but because you've compressed the spring, technically you have less spring travel. So you don't want too much of that, and you don't want too little of it either. Too little, of course, means that the initial break of the compression will be very easy, whereas if you had too much, it would be not very plush at the beginning, but rather very stiff right away, especially with the progressive springs in there. So I did some research, and based on Racetech's suggestions, Racetech is a company that makes springs and other suspension components. They suggest for street bikes that you have between 28 and 33% static sag. And for road race bikes, 23 to 27% road race sag. So with my pre-cut spacers, really what I'm looking at is the 4-inch and 5/8 and the 5-inch are more well suited for road racing, and the 5 and 3/8, the 4 and 3/8 and the 4-inch are kind of more the road for a street bike. The 4-inch is actually too much. I guess the best one for us is the 4-inch 3/8. So let's put that back on there. All right, we're back with the 4-inch and 3/8 spacers. The fork actually hasn't lost any of its fork length. So that's great. So that means that it's actually okay to slide the fork tubes up through the fork triple trees to reduce that actual fork length. And the other thing that we're going to do is we're also going to add some air pressure into the forks, just so we can try to see how that's going to affect the static sag as well. I believe it's going to actually reduce it a little bit, which is perfect because that's what we want. We want to be not at the top end of the street bike suggestions, but somewhere in the middle. So between that 28 and 33% of overall travel. So let's add 14 psi air pressure into the forks, slide them up perhaps 30 mil, and try things out afterwards like that. So let's do it. All right, so after putting in the 4-inch 3/8 spacer back in there, putting 14 psi of air pressure in the forks, and dropping them 40 millimeters through the triple trees, actually I'm getting a very different number for the static sag. With this setup, my static sag is closer to 47.5%, So the springs are far too soft, or the progressive portion of them is far too soft with this setup. So I'll need to do one of two things: either pull the forks back up through the triple trees, or add a bigger spacer for more preload at this sort of length. So I believe it's going to be a combination of the two, just so we can get back into being right in between that 28 to 33% static sag. All right, so the bike is jacked up again, and I realized I made another mistake with the calculations. So when I had the 4" and 3/8 spacers in there, the calculations I did for the sag with the 40mm drop were based on the length from the dust seal to the bottom of the yoke, based on the forks being at their stock state. So that's why I was getting that massive number of 47.5% of static sag, which is actually incorrect. So I realized my mistake, that by moving the forks up 40mm, I've actually reduced this distance by 40mm as well. So when I computed the numbers again, turns out that with the 4" 3/8 and a 40mm drop, I'm actually down to 18.93% of static sag, which is way too little, instead of it being way too much. And to confirm that, now that I have the 4 5/8, I did the number there, and that one produces 15.71% static sag. So interestingly enough, by moving the forks up through the triple trees, you're effectively reducing static sag, or at least I'm not sure if that's a the effect of the progressive springs, since by moving the forks up, you are technically shifting more of the weight on the front, so the preload actually becomes stronger and the springs are actually pushing back. So what that means is that the 4 5/8 is actually too much. It's going to be too stiff. So we're going to switch back to the 4 3/8, and we're actually going to start dropping the forks back down through the triple trees until we're nicely seated between the 28 to 33% static sag, or somewhere closer to the 28, I would say. So let's do that. All right, so after doing the math, turns out that with this setup, where we have the 4.38 or 4" 3/8 spacer with the 14 psi air pressure and the 70mm offset, or the 30mm extra offset from the stock setup, we're getting about 26.07%, which is again much better than before, but still not quite in that 28 to 33 range. So one last attempt we're going to take at this is we're going to pull the forks down another 5mm. As it seems, for every 10mm, we're increasing quite a bit in sag. So we're going to pull them down another 5mm, and hopefully that will land us right smack in the middle of the 28 to 33. So one of the important things that I forgot to mention with measuring static sag, which was kind of implied, but I should probably mention it, is the static sag and the preload on the bike is very specific to the bike itself and the rider and the equipment on the motorcycle. So if you have a motorcycle that has saddlebags, you're a bigger person or you're a smaller person, the setup would be different for you. So make sure to either do the math or iterate the way I've done it until you find something that works just right for you. All right, so after about 20 different iterations, which I'll post on the side over here, I've finally identified kind of the sweet spot for the front suspension, which is essentially using a 4" spacer, and either using a 20 or 30mm offset on the forks, and then adjusting the air pressure based on that. With the 20mm, we're actually more on the ball With the 30 millimeter, we get a little bit more on the aggressive side and closer to the road race bike kind of stats. But either way, both of them are kind of within that 28 to 33% range, which is great. So I'll play around a little bit with my geometry simulation tool to see whether another 20 or 30 millimeter offset is actually working better in terms of trail and wheelbase and rake. Make sure to subscribe, hit the little bell for notifications when new videos become available. Check me out on Instagram at balconmoto2018, and make sure to check out balconmoto.com where I have articles and different tools you can use for your own builds. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.